30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
We got a roll program.
Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading.
Live from historic Pearson Field, in cooperation with Aero Maintenance Flight Schools, the pilotintheclassroom.com presents the third Saturday Safety Seminar.
All right. I'm going to talk loud too. So welcome everyone, and welcome to everybody who's joined us online. I'm Brig Williams. I'm an educator in Southwest Washington and a flight instructor, and I have a little website called pilotintheclassroom.com. I hope you get the joke there, pilot and teacher. But this is truly a lot of advocacy work for me, and we're going to talk about me here in a second, which I normally don't like to do. But I think it's important today when we're talking about brain functioning and the startle response. So I want to kind of give you my background so that you know I'm just not a CFI up here reading off a script from the FAA. This, by the way, came out in about January, April. It was pushed out to the FAST teams, and I put it in my back pocket because it really aligns to my thinking and my philosophy as an instructor. And I've had a couple of other seminars that hint upon some of the concepts here. So we're going to go into more details about that. But for those of you who are in person, and thank you for being here, and thank you for joining us online or watching the recording as well. But remember that we do have exits. We have a door right here with a very steep stairway, so be careful if you go down there, or you can go straight out the main hallway stairs. If there is an emergency, we're going to ask that everybody goes to the grass area between the FBO and the museum. We're not going to have any breaks. This is probably going to be about 30 minutes or so. But if you do need to use the facilities, we have 2 restrooms. The men is down the hallway, and the women's is right there at the corner. And I also would like to thank Pearson Field and also Aero Maintenance. Aero Maintenance has always been a good partner for the FAST teams, and we are super excited to be bringing back the third Saturday safety seminars again. I tried this right before COVID. We were getting a good response, and then we got side railed there for the virus that will never be named again, nevermore. So I will try not to use that word again. And once again, if you like what you see, please tell people to go to pilotintheclassroom.com, watch the video again. It's great that we can get people out in live persons once, but we have about 4,000 pilots in the Portland FSDO alone, right? So we need to get more people involved with the knowledge activity, because a pilot is always learning. So who am I? Well, I have been in training and education for 30 plus years, either in public education or in private sector training. I have literally taught everyone from kindergartners through 12th grade to training teachers, training firemen, in training pilots and being a dive instructor in college. So if I wasn't in public education, we're going to talk about how that relates to our message today. But scuba divers, first responders, and pilots, we are dealing with essentially life support systems, right? We do take an element of risk to try to do that safely. So I look back and I go, wow, I spent my whole career doing these things. Maybe it's time for me to become an instructor. So I was a late bloomer in aviation. I started in college, realized that if I would solo, I would go bankrupt doing it, break my parents' hearts by not finishing college, you know. And so life happens, family and everything else. So I found out later, though, I was your average pilot in my late 30s, right? Took about 65 hours to do it. And as a school teacher, only got to fly 30 or 40 hours a year, just enough to barely keep the rust off, right? So I was always active in WINGS as a pilot to stay proficient, constantly training. I've only had one flight review. Everything else has been WINGS or additional certificates. So I got to that point after my commercial, hey, do I want to get an airplane? Okay, once again, I'm a school teacher. That's probably not going to work. So people convinced me to become a flight instructor, and I did that primarily to do these, right? To do WINGS seminars, because I have two passions. One is to grow the pilot population, but then the other one is to make sure our general aviation pilots are safe and healthy and continuing to fly, because if not, right, we're at risk. We only have 120,000 private pilots with an active medical. To put that into perspective, we have about 120,000 flight instructors. Most of those are ATP and not actively instructing. So we are a small group out of that thing, and so it's important that we keep this proficiency, and WINGS is perfect for that. In public education, I use brain research daily, and as the demographics of our country change, we are finding that we have the need in public education to do more what we call trauma-informed teaching. A lot of our students now have some type of adverse childhood experiences that creates some trauma in the brain, and there's now research and CT scans and everything else that says parts of the brain actually deaden when you have some types of trauma. And so we'll talk about I'm safe. There's some serious things with that stress as pilots. We need to realize that in a startle response becomes a factor. Regular flying, not a factor. When we get to the startle response, it can be devastating. So it seems a lot. So I wanted to tell you that just because I do have some background with how the brain works, especially in that learning and also in the high stress environment. So today we're going to talk about human mental functioning, human response to stimuli, what we call the startle response, and then talk about the hazards to general aviation flight operations and risk mitigation strategies and tactics, and then what you can do as private pilots to help mitigate some of this. So let's talk about a simple blueprint of the brain. The brain is very complex. We're getting better understandings of it each year. Our understanding of it grows, so this is very simplified. So it starts with our senses, right? Sight, touch, smell, taste, our hearing, even balance. Those are our senses. Those are our inputs. We don't see everything in the world. There's lights that we can't see. There's magnetic things that we can't see. We can create technology to help us with that, but then we have to interpret that through our own senses, which are very limited to what's actually happening in the world. We take those senses and we put that into that conscious workspace where we have a filter for our attention, right? There's things that we want to be looking for, our brain's kind of working on, and we filter out the things that we think we shouldn't be paying attention to. We also have this idea of that long-term memory. We have short-term memory, long-term memory. Short-term memory can become long-term memory through repetition and practice. And this is our knowledge base, right? It's like our random access memory, where the conscious workspace is kind of like the CPU, right? It's actually doing the processing. They work kind of back and forth. We take in the senses, we kind of filter it, we run that with what we already know, and we make predictions of what our senses are telling us. And then we get an output. Now, believe it or not, our output is very limited, right? I mean, it goes into a kinesthetic function, or more thinking. Even speaking is a kinesthetic function in a lot of ways, right? Even writing, making decisions, we finally have to act on those. And then we, of course, then have the, I'm going to go back there, we have that feedback loop, right? So we see what's happening, we base that upon our senses again, right? And we keep on doing this. And we do this pretty well, right? Even children can do this operation fairly well for the knowledge base that they have. But if your knowledge base changes, right, you're going to get a different response, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. So when we are comparing our CPU and our random access memory, the conscious workspace, and long term, you can see that in the conscious workspace, we have the sequential processing. You know, the idea of multitasking is a myth. We can do one thing very rapidly with multiple things, but we can't really truly be doing many things at once. We have our general problem solvers. Any engineers with us today? Okay. Our conscious workspace has limited capacity, right? There's only so much we can do. It's based upon the contents available. It's slow and laborious, but essential for learning new tasks. Long-term memory, though, is a parallel processing. It's there. It's a vast collection of experiences. There's no limit or size, right? We can keep on getting more memories and more knowledge, and it's unconscious to an extent. It should be rapid and effortless unless you are really trying to think about where your keys are, right? And you can't find them, but that's short-term memory. And we handle familiar routines and habits. Now, this is where we're going to get into trouble with pilots. We all remember in ground school those things where they show a picture and you don't see the airplane there because it's blocked. Or our brain will fill in an area that we can't see with what we think it should be there. So there's a lot of things in these routines that there are problems for us to get into. So conscious workspace, trial and error, and then that long-term memory is programming. We're going to come back to how this fits in. So let's do a little exercise right now. At home, do this as well. Oh, we're going to go back here. So I want you to connect A to A, B to B, C to C, but no lines can ever cross paths. No intersections. How would you do that? Give me a thumbs up if you think you have it. All right?
If you take the C, go just over the B to the other C, the B go just under the C to the left to the other B, and you can kind of wind the A around that little tunnel you've created.
Oh, let's see. I think that might. Is that how you figured it out?
I think I missed part of that, but I would connect B to B and then C to C on above, and then A all the way around.
Okay, let's see what the FAA says. Okay, B to B. All right. C to C. All right. And then A. All right. Okay. Took a little time though, right? We can figure things out. Takes a little time. Let's try this. Mary had a. His fleece was white as snow, and everywhere Mary went, the land was surely to go. 2 times 2 is? All right. The square of the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to Yeah, so a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared, the Pythagorean theorem, right? All right. And any young people watching right now, yes, see, it's important to know that. Okay. I'm looking for a volunteer to read. Okay.
We are creatures of habit. Long-term memory programs rely heavily on visual information and pattern recognition habits. Pilots are particularly adept at pattern recognition, and usually that works well for them, but occasionally that human tendency causes problems. Running a familiar program in response to a different situation or running a correct program improperly can result in disaster.
Okay. I don't know if at home you guys were able to see that, but so I'm going to read it again and correct me if I'm wrong. I better put my glasses on. So long-term memory programs rely heavily on visual information and pattern recognition habits. This is not correct, but we can still figure it out, right? Pilots are particularly adept to pattern recognition, and usually that works well for them, but occasionally that human tendency causes problems. What happens if this was actually a different language and all these different words had different meanings? All right? If you walked up to a sign that says there's landmines in the area and you just use your regular routine, you might find yourself in a very explosive situation. Running a familiar program in response to a different situation or running a correct program improperly can result in disaster. And it's that last paragraph as pilots we need to be concerned about, especially in that startled response where we don't have the time to figure out how A and B and C are going to get to each other without crossing paths. Sour? I'm not a lemon guy. Let's see, you see your next responses here. This one looks like my dog right here. Yeah. I'm not a cat guy. But cute, right? Ooh, danger. We have these natural responses. Some of these responses are just so primordial, right? That it's just programmed to us in birth, right? And that's where we have to start understanding some brain research. So when we talk about the brain, and we teach kids very young, we start teaching them about brains. And the way that we do this in education is that we say, this is your brain. And you really have two brains. You have what we call the lizard brain. And now I'm going to say this word wrong. I always do. I've had psychologists try to help me out with this word, and I always say it wrong. So I'm just telling you at home, be kind to me. And that's this amygdala. The lizard brain, primordial brain. It's all of our fight and flight, right? Emotions, right? We don't want that to take over. And so the brain tries to keep that part of us very happy and contented. And we wrap that around what we would call the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is very simple, but if it works for a third grader, I figured it might work for a pilot. Our prefrontal cortex is that conscious workspace. That gives us our executive functioning. It gives us our language, ability to communicate, the ability to reason, the ability to manage our emotions and our controls. The amygdala, though, is so primordial that if you are suddenly startled, or you get upset, or you get emotional, you can literally blow your top. And once you have blown your top and you have lost your executive functioning ability, your ability to reason, to think, right? It takes several hours for that to come back down and to make the amygdala happy again. But there's a problem. The bond of the prefrontal cortex is lessened. And so another input that startles you or upsets you, you are more than likely to pop again and to pop again. And for students, right, we try to teach them emotional controls. We call that social emotional learning, which I think is kind of getting some bad rap right now. How to keep that prefrontal cortex together. Now, I mentioned before I was going to make a connection to I'm safe. Right? Illness, medication, stress, fatigue, right? And eating. If you are in a high stress situation, you might be okay to go fly, right? Do your normal routines. But what happens if you hit a startled response? Your brain is more than likely is going to lose that executive functioning. Or it might take you a little longer for it to get back and to react to something that startles you. This is a problem. I have some pet peeves flying. One of them is this idea of gripping the yoke. I call it a death grip. The reason I'm worried about that is coming into land, if you are startled, and you go into the fight or flight response, our body is designed to get tense. We pull back. In flying, our response needs to keep that nose down at all costs, right? So if you get startled and you have a good grip on the yoke and you put it into a stall, right? You can get into problems. So having a loose grip, understanding as a pilot, we got to keep the nose down on the aircraft. These are important things. However, this part of the brain is so strong. So how do we overcome that? So let's talk about some times that maybe this didn't work. So this is a 175 Cessna, partial power loss on takeoff. Uh-oh, this isn't good. Tries to make the possible turn, sharp right turn, right back to the airport. When we put an aircraft in a sharp turn, and in order to turn that, we have to have more elevator control. That puts us into what's called an accelerated stall. How many people have ever practiced accelerated stalls before? Okay. When's the last time you practiced accelerated stalls?
Years.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. How many private pilots do I have in here? Okay. Commercial pilots? Okay. Any ATPs? Okay, good. So commercial pilots, CFIs, we have to do those accelerated stalls. That can lead very quickly into a stall, spin, crash, or there's a new report that just came out. I don't know if you guys saw it. I think it was Sporties, that there's some more research that says they're not really true stall spins. They're stall spirals. Same effect, right? I mean, semantics. But we get into them in the same way. This one only had 1 fatality, but also 3 injuries. How many people do a pre-takeoff brief before calling Pearson Advisory? Okay. It's so important because that loads, not only does it activate our long-term memory, it puts long-term memory into short-term memory, right? And it allows us to start thinking so that we can get out of that startled response. These are the ones that I'm always worried about. Door popped open during takeoff. Day VFR, cross-country flight, cabin door opens, the pilot requests to return to the airport. Same outcome. I tell students all the time when I do flight reviews and everything else, don't let a small problem become a big problem. Why? Because you get startled, right? And then you're not in your normal routine, or you're in your normal routine doing it incorrectly. We expect doors to stay closed and engines to keep running, right? I don't know about you, but every time right up until rotation, I am assuming that engine will fail on me. That's my mindset when I fly, right? Not that, hey, everything's going to be great, and I'm worried, especially now that we have some of the buildings right there, right? What am I going to do, right? And a new one coming. Just like in anything else in life, when the amygdala starts to take over, we get denial, anger, bargaining. I can get out of this. Or depress, right? These hazardous attitudes are coming out here. Or acceptance. Oh, well, this is what we're going to do. So how do we prepare for the unexpected? Anybody had an opportunity to do any emergency training in the simulator that we have here? Okay. So I've started now when I'm doing wings. So somebody says, hey, I want to get a phase of wings. I say, great, we're going to put some time into the simulator. Simulators are great for simulating emergencies because there's a couple things that are happening there that I like. First of all, you're not familiar with the simulator. So your brain is already processing a whole bunch of other things that you wouldn't necessarily process in the cockpit of your own airplane. You're comfortable with it. You know where everything is. So all of a sudden you're at this higher anxiety level in there. And then I can put you into any situation, right? Engine failure on takeoff, flight into IMC. I can put you into an area where you have a CFIT, right? I can have you guys do a glide. And it's a great way for you to go, oh, I just realized what I did wrong, right? And hopefully to do some training. So simulators are fantastic for working on the unexpected. So consider the hazards associated with each phase of flight. Think about what could go wrong, and then plan for how you will deal with that problem. And then you train. I love what Neil Armstrong said once. He says, don't ever take your hand off the switch until you get the predicted performance you expected, because in an emergency, you will never find that switch again, right? This happens quite a bit. We have a couple of airplanes that doesn't have a toggle return on the flap operators. And so somebody will jump in that airplane for a checkout, and they're used to one that, well, you just push down and it'll come back up. And then they do that, and it goes to, and all of a sudden they're at 40 degrees of flaps. They're going, what's going on? I'm with them. I see what's going on, right? I can walk them through. But in a real situation, that could be disastrous, right? And we're going to talk about that here in a second. Think about what you would do, but then go out and try it, right? There's a lot of things we can do at altitude. So let's talk about power loss, right? This is one that we train all the time with student pilots, right? Now, I'm going to be a little critical here, and I'm a CFI too, and I've been guilty of some of this, but I don't think we train properly for this response. There's a couple of things that I think that we do that now I change in my training with students. One is when I pull the power on a student, I want them to push the power back in. Because throttle creep is a real thing in flight. How many people ever had the throttle fall out of them when they were adjusting trim on takeoff? Didn't ever have your thing adjusted correctly and the throttle falls out? It's happened to me as a student pilot, right? So I remember that and keep that sucker tight. But what are we going to do on power loss? So there's things that we need to do in our training in order to become automatic about that, right? To put it in the long term so that when we need it in an emergency, we have it. So what's the first thing we do in a, I should have take that back here. What is the first thing that we do when we lose power? What are we trained to do?
Panic.
Huh? Panic! Oh no! Okay. Best glide. I find myself now using the term the published engine out speed. The reason is that it's not best glide. Best glide has a lot of other different factors. We say best glide, but in reality, When you practice best glide in the airplane with a engine that's at idle, especially if it's at a fast idle, you're not going to get the same glide ratio in a true emergency. So best glide is difficult, but you are right. Best glide, fly the airplane, aviate. Whatever you do, fly the airplane. It's been said probably since the Wright brothers, fly that airplane through the crash. Don't stop flying that airplane once. Once we do, right, we're no longer the pilot in command. So establish your best glide or your best engine out speed. Mooney, right?
Yes.
What's your best glide?
100 miles an hour is what I target for any engine failure right off the bat.
How do you find it?
Well, it's not necessarily the correct glide speed, but it's an easily identifiable mark on the airspeed indicator that I can strive for.
Great.
But if I go to the pilot's operating handbook, there's actually a graph of your weight and altitude and everything. So
I think 10 knots either side of best glide, you're probably going to make it, right? It's how you respond, but how do you find that airspeed?
The airspeed indicator I have, although I have not marked a line on
Yeah.
it, 100 stands out on the airspeed indicator. It's very visible, and that's why I strive for 100 miles an hour,
Okay.
not the 92 miles an hour that's published or whatever.
Okay.
So,
I'm going to rephrase this because I don't think I'm asking the question correctly. You're flying along, you're going to Montana, you're whipping at 140 knots, you lose your engine. How do you find 100?
look at the airspeed. I
Yeah,
guess.
okay. So my point is too, and I ask students about this all the time in a 172, how do you find your best glide? Where is it on the trim setting? A rough trim setting, right? From any of those, right? Where we lose power, we're gonna raise the nose, and then we want to trim for it, right? To let it go. We got to aviate. We're flying that airplane the whole time. So what's the next thing we do?
I wanted to add one more statement to what you just asked me.
Okay.
My focus about the engine failure is always about departure off this airport. Everything I do, I could care less about en route because that's an easy thing to play with. You got time, startle response and all that, but taking off and losing an engine, that's what I always focus on, is because that's what's going to get me killed.
Yep.
So push the nose forward right away, because in the Mooney, you're going to bleed speed fairly quickly.
Yeah.
There's a huge trim pitch change with engine failure. So
Yeah. Okay. So you're already thinking about it, and that's what I like, right? You know the airplane you are flying.
doesn't mean I'll be successful, because I will be startled, I'll panic, I'll screw it up,
Yeah.
and you'll be talking about me for years after that.
You'd be looking at all those buildings down there.
And buildings.
Yeah.
That's why I aim for the water
Yep.
really quickly.
Well, as I like to say, Pearson pilots are proficient pilots. We have to be, right? We fly out a very unique airspace. We fly the airplane. What's next? Okay, best place to land. We navigate. Aviate, navigate. Then what?
Communicate.
Communicate. To me, checklist is that form of communication. Even thinking. These first two things should be automatic, right? That's what we do as pilots. I'm going to bird walk right now, but there's a lot of free movie sites out there, and John Wayne's, which is an Ernest Gantz book, Island in the Sky, the guy who also wrote High and the Mighty. Watch Island in the Sky, because the intro really, I think, talks very well of what pilots need to do. And so anyways, I'll leave that as an Easter egg for you. So diagnose the problem. Go through your loss of power checklist. Now, here's another one that for me as an instructor, I disagree with slightly. Not to say don't use a checklist. That's not what I'm saying. But to me, flying the airplane, I don't need a checklist to tell me that I need 3 things to get that engine going. I need, right, fuel, air, and spark. And as I'm checking, pitching for best glide, finding my landing spot, I am intuitively going in, mixture rich, right, throttle in, carb heat out, work the mags, and then come back and, okay, that didn't work. I'm in a glide. I know where I'm going. What can we do now?
what you should do first. Undo what you just did.
Right? Switching a tank.
Yeah.
Yeah, back to that Neil Armstrong thing. What's the last button you touched?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Restore power and continue if you can. If not, commit to land. All right, and then activate ELTs, cell phones, right? Call. Sometimes 121.5 is not your best answer if you're on 122.9 here in the local area. Everybody's on that frequency now. Right, or if you're on 119, right, talking to the tower, they're going to hear it as well. So think about those and then do that. And then once, of course, 1,000 feet above the ground, right, you're now flying the airplane. So things have to be put into that long-term memory and do that. So here's now where I'm worried about as a flight instructor, as a member of the safety team, in terms of training. So everybody knows the 172, best glide is about 65. We can find that because we throw all the back trim to the stop, right? And that's going to give us usually 60 to 65. That's fine. You found your spot, you're going, you're heading there. But it's that last 100 feet that usually gets us pilots. Why? I have some theories about that. I don't know if I'm right or correct, but I've seen it in training. I'm at 65. How do we land? What do we always put in when we land an airplane? We put in flaps. We want to land at the slowest possible airspeed. So we dump the flaps. What happens to our airspeed? Decays. What happens to our pitch? Yeah, our pitch. What happens to our best glide? We're now steeper. I'm not going to clear that fence. So what do we do as pilots? We pull back on the yoke, right? Because our brain then takes over. I ask pilots all the time, and I don't want to be like joking about a serious topic, but so I ask them, what controls airspeed in an airplane? And it's like the Manchurian Candidate. They tell you, right? Like, he was the nicest lieutenant I've ever known. They said, pitch controls airspeed. But you look in their eyes and they don't believe it, right? Power controls airspeed, right? I go up or I go down, right? And we lose that in that emergency of that pitch and power relationship, which is so important, right? It's trying to stretch the glide. How many people remember being taught on an emergency landing, you're shooting for the middle of the field? Because when you dump flaps, you're not going to, that sight picture is now going to change on you. You have no other way, right? So there's little things that we lose over time in our training that we need to remember how to do. Because a lot of the times you see things coming in and it's not the power loss that got them. It's the pilot input of that airplane in the last couple hundred feet. I think as Pearson pilots, we get this really well, right? Where is the least convenient place to lose power?
Right off the end of the runway.
Right? Is that takeoff?
Yeah.
So this is interesting. In this slide deck with the FAA, they're considering takeoff that initial rotation area, right? So that's takeoff, that kind of that ground roll to rotation. And if you don't like what's happening, you still might have some time to stop. How much stop weight do we have on runway 26?
2,000 feet.
Is that how long the grass area is?
That was a guess on my part.
Yeah, I think it's like 800, right? Yeah. So we have like roughly 3,500 feet of runway. We have another 800 stop distance. This happens to you on 8. How tall is the berm at the end of the runway, right? Too tall, right? So now, right, there's that area. Can I set it back down? Now, if we're on those 10,000 foot runways, yeah, right, least of a problem in a small aircraft, right? We'll be able to come back. So when we take a look at it, takeoff is pretty critical. Landing's critical, right? We're close to the ground. Climb, right? We're a little higher. Approach, maybe less, maybe we're still in that gliding distance to the airport. The descent, we usually maybe have a lot of different options, right? Airspeed's life, altitude is insurance. And then cruise is, as you said, kind of the least one, right? I mean, that's where we usually have a lot more altitude, we have a lot more time, and our workload is less. Our workload is less. But in honesty, if it's climb. Full power, steep angle of attack, we lose power there, right? And especially for a lot of us who hold on to that yoke, and we're already in a gravity position, it takes a lot to recognize I just lost an engine. We got to use our ears, our sight, even our smell, and then to get that nose down to best glide.
Especially when you're right over the middle of downtown Vancouver.
Especially, right? Takeoff can be tough too, depending on how short your runway is. I did a couple of years ago during COVID, we did the short field takeoff seminar. That's still online. But I asked people, where's your rotation spot supposed to be? So if you go fly with me, I'm going to say, where's the wheels going to leave the ground on the airport? Nobody knows. Well, a lot of people will say, if I'm not at 71% power by 50% of the way of the runway, I'm going to abort my takeoff run. It's spoken like a true single engine pilot, right? If you're a twin engine pilot, that's different. So my thing is, if at the halfway point, do you still have enough stop distance for your aircraft? Thinking about, I'm up here, I still need to come down, and then I still need a stop for the brakes to work. Right? And how do you find that information? A lot of planning goes on, especially into shorter strips. Cruise is the one that we have the least worries about, right? I mean, until you get to the last couple hundred feet. And that's where that startle response can come in if we're doing those normal routines incorrectly. Landing's is still a tough one, right? Landing short, you're not going to clear that fence. Descent, you're already losing some altitude, right? So as you're coming down, you're losing places to land, and of course on that the approach area, depending on how far you're out. So how do we train for these, right? So scenario-based training is big. That's why I like the simulator. A lot of those takeoff ones that we can't really do in an airplane, right? We can get up to altitude and try it, but it's not the same sight picture. There isn't that, oh my gosh, what's happening, right? So simulators are great for doing that. And take a look at those identified risks and what you might need to do. On that short field one, I talk about our typical training loads, right? Two people in the front seat, nothing in the back, not near gross wake. Our airplanes do not fly the same when they are fully loaded and you have weight in the back, right? If you're doing your normal thing, it's not going to be correct. So there's ways to fix that, right? Like for students, we have buckets of sand that we can put in back, change the loading of the aircraft so that they can get the feel for that. Brief each phase of flight. We do a really poor job of briefing landings. How many people do a safety briefing before they come into land? How long is the runway? What's my stop distance? What's my outs? We do it on the ground, but then up in the air, we fail to do that on the landings. Now, you come in that same airport all the time, you're pretty comfortable with it, but let's say if you go into Woodland, right, or a different airport, what are you going to do? It's the unannounced emergency situations, right? In Alaska, they call them moose stalls, right? You're circling around, you're low to the ground, you got to divide your attention, you get everything, and you have an emergency. I'm more concerned about bird strikes up here in the Pacific Northwest, right? You get a big enough bird hitting that prop, you might be losing power very quickly, right? Especially if you're down low to the ground or doing maneuvering flight. So how are you going to respond to those? There's a lot of training now talking about putting yourself in an unusual flight situation. So like stalls, right? Practice stalls, but most people don't ever stall straight ahead. It's always in a turning motion, right? But we don't really practice those all too often. One caveat here, and I think this is important for any flight instructors that are watching this video as well. Please, 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 after you are done doing emergency training, pull out the checklist and make sure you are configured correctly. We have many incidences where instead of pulling the throttle, the flight instructor has pulled the mixture. It happens. We're all human, right? So it's important after emergencies, take a second, get some altitude, run through your checklist, make sure you are configured correctly. The FAA has this is a download, it's an Excel file. AOPA also has a flight risk calculator. But if you are especially thinking about a flight that might be new to you or through a new situation, you need to do some type of risk assessment on your flight. And brief before you fly. I mean, today it's so easy, right? We have satellite photographs. We have all these other tools to really know what's happening in the area. Almost every airport has a website if they have a unique type of flow in and out of their airport. So much easier now to find this information. And then think about what will you do. But more importantly, it's this last one. And this is where it's near and dear to my heart. We do a great job of getting people out to the seminars. We get a great job of people taking online courses. We're still about, out of 4,000 pilots in the Portland FSDO, we're a little less than 400 who has an active phase of wings. Now, we hear this a lot. Why do I need to do wings when I can do a flight review once every 2 years, do an hour ground, and go fly with my buddy for a hamburger? That's fine, right? I get that. The flight instructor, if they are running a proper flight review, will count for a phase of wings. You're now proficient. Now the job is to stay proficient. Proficiency training is dealing with those things that are unusual that we need practice with. And the other misconception is that it's not always 3 flights that you have to do with an instructor, especially for basic. If you are flying at a proficient level, right, we can sign you off. It's like a flight review. Now, there are times, though, that we, and especially with our GA pilots, fly with an instructor a couple times a year. And then we get the argument, well, why, that costs money. Holy moly, in an industry where the smallest switch is $1,000, right? We don't have $200 a year to train with an instructor. It boggles my mind. But there's so much more that we can do in that proficiency training. Who are my commercial pilots in the group? All right, great. Not a commercial pilot?
I am. I just never use it.
Ah, this brings up my next point. You can never go down without turning that certificate in. That means if you are ever involved with an action, you can't say, but I was just a private pilot. No, you're a commercial pilot. When's the last time you did chandelles?
What year is this?
Yeah. I get ATPs in some of my seminars, and I ask them that question. They go, oh, my check ride, you know. So that's one of those things that if you hold that certificate, your flight review should be saying that you are flying proficiently at that certificate level, right? So get back up with an instructor, go do some chandelles, go do some lazy 8s, right? Do an accelerated stall. Go do those practicing with the instructor. Any questions? I truly appreciate you all being here today. It's so great to do these again. Please get out and fly with an instructor. So this is what's going to be happening. This was a Knowledge 1 activity. Next month, the third Saturday of October, there will be a Knowledge 2 activity seminar. See the pattern? Using our conscious workspace here. In November, we're going to have a Knowledge 3 activity. The only thing you would have to do is get with an instructor and do your 3 flight activities. And once again, that's not always 3 flights, right? There are 3 flight activities, and they basically break down to this way: takeoff and landings, navigation, and emergencies. Now, it seems to me that anytime we fly, as Tom, our chief pilot says, we have never lost one up there yet, right? Every aircraft that has gone up has came back down. So you're going to do those. You're going to get out to the practice area, right? That's a form of navigation. And then we can work on some emergencies. So I want to spend a second on here because I think this is important for people to remember about what, as an instructor, we're looking for. So remember with instructors, what's our power? What's our superpower? Anybody know this one?
Charge a bill.
Yeah. Our superpower is the power of the pen, right? So every time an instructor is signing you off, they are basically saying to the government, you're good, right? It's kind of a little bit of a shared liability there, right? But that's the power of the instructor. It doesn't necessarily mean that the instructor is a better pilot than you or that we know your airplane. So if I jump in with you in your airplane and you don't give me a safety briefing that's required, a passenger briefing that is required under the CFRs, I'm worried. If you're taxiing along, playing with radios, chit-chatting, not having a sterile cockpit, I'm worried. We get up to the run-up area and you don't do a safety briefing, I'm going to ask you, would you please do a normal takeoff for me? But as instructors, we know who our proficient pilots are. So I might say, hey, do a soft field for me. Because I tell you what, if you can do a soft field takeoff, you can do a normal takeoff. And I'm pretty sure that you can hold the brakes, put in the power, and do a short field takeoff, maybe. We'll find out. Same thing up in the air. If you know how to handle your airplane and you're comfortable and you're doing everything really well, we'll take you to some more advanced things, right? But we're looking for that proficiency. If you don't quite have that proficiency when we get on the ground, it's like, you know what? I want to fly with you another time, right? And these are the reasons that I want to work on. Question?
Yeah. Could you just briefly go over what happened with the emergency that Phil Mandel went through when he was taking off here? And did he turn around and come back, or I can't remember? Yeah,
he did. They had a partial power, and they did do a turn back to the airport.
But he did have some power to do that. He didn't lose everything.
Well, I'm not quite sure. You would need to ask Phil on that one. I'm sure he'll be running that seminar again.
The video,
yeah.
I can't remember.
It's a worry, right? And it's a good hangar discussion of what you would do. I think you need to know what you're going to do, right? You should have a plan. You shouldn't be formulating a plan at 300 feet. You should have that one already made and decided upon. Any other questions? Thank you for coming out. I'm going to end the live stream right now, and then I'll be able to.
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay. Yes.
What is you said what are you going to cover next time?
So, good question. Any ideas?
You're the one that's telling me.
Okay. The one that I was thinking that I didn't get to do before COVID started was on disorientation. So I'm thinking about now. Some of you came to my throwback Saturdays where I take old FAA safety films from the '60s, and we watch them. And there's some other great people on YouTube that have them hosted. And so there's one on disorientation. which I think is really critical, especially now going into the cloudy months here in the Pacific Northwest. So that's probably the next one. But I haven't decided yet because I have a couple instructors that I'm waiting to hear back on if they would come in and be a guest and present some information. So I have one who was a former instructor here who's now an ATP, and we're seeing if he can make it. So, any other questions? All right, you guys are awesome. Let me stop this.